With our API now running, and with the understanding that we are using a RESTful pattern for our API, which describes resources, and then the actions or the CRUD operations we're taking on those resources reflected by the HTTP method that we're using, we're going to go ahead and in our to-do app, we are going to implement getting a full list of to-dos from the API, as well as implementing the creation of a new item through an HTTP post using that common URL that we saw in Postman, which is just this one right here. So to start that off, we're going to need to make sure that we have access to the root of our API location, so the root URL to our API, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to implement that inside of our front end. So we're going to leave this back end running, come into our front end, and then in our front end, we're going to follow a similar pattern to what we do in our back end, and we are going to create a new file here because we need access to that root URL from within all of our components in order to use the API. So here we've got subscriptions, which was available to all components, and it sits inside of our lib folder. Well, we're going to add another one, and we're going to call it config.js. And just like we do here in our subscriptions, we're just going to export const, and we're going to export that URL. So export const, and we're going to call this our, and we're going to follow the same pattern since it's a const. We're just going to make everything uppercase. So API base URL equals, and then we're going to use the base URL right here because we have it currently running on port 8080. Now the reason why we're doing this is because when we compile this and we were to move it to production, we would want to change this to whatever our actual URL is to our API server once it's deployed to the internet. We're not going to be able to use localhost. It's going to be a completely different URL. And instead of hard coding this URL in every single one of our requests to our API, we're going to hard code it just in this config file. And then when we deploy, we would change this to whatever the production URL is. And then inside of our actual components, we're going to call in our config. We're going to use this base URL string in order to build our actual URL call or our API calls that we're going to make to our API. So let's close our subscriptions, close our config. And now the first one that we need to convert over is going to be our app.js. Now, before we dive any deeper, let's go ahead and talk about how we're going to make calls. Now, in JavaScript, we are provided the fetch API within browsers. And the majority of modern browsers support the fetch API. So if we go to the developer.mozilla.org, which is the MDN, which is probably the best resource for JavaScript, and we look at this fetch API, we can learn all about the fetch API. And really what we're going to be doing is we are going to be using this API to make calls. So after you read about the fetch API right here, the concepts and usage, come down to the bottom and then let's go to using fetch. And right here inside of our fetch, using fetch documentation, we can see how we can use fetch inside of our browsers to make requests. Now in a regular Create React app application, this async and await version of using the fetch API doesn't necessarily work across all browsers. So we're actually going to use the good old promise format. So I'm going to show you how to use the promise, but from these examples we can see some stuff that's important. When we do a call with fetch, it is an asynchronous call. In other words, the asynchronous call is going to be sent across the internet and we don't know when it's going to be completed. And instead of wrapping everything inside of an async function and calling that function like they're doing right here, we're just going to use promises straight up inside of our React application. And we're not going to overcomplicate it really right here. So we are going to be using different methods such as post and get. Now, by default, fetch is a get operation, meaning that we really just have to provide the URL that we're calling across the internet. In this case, it's localhost. And then the data that, or the parameters that we want to use inside of that HTTP request. So if we do a fetch, we provide just a URL, it's automatically going to default to a get. If we want to do something like a post, then we have to provide this configuration object, and then we would specify the method that we're going to use. Another important thing that we're going to want to specify is in our headers, we're going to want to specify the content type of what we are sending. And that comes back to in Postman, when we were trying to, or when we try to post a body, we need to make sure that the return type isn't text, but that it is JSON. Otherwise, our API won't pick it up. So those are the two important ones that we're going to be using. Our methods, so the method, and we're going to do a get and a post, and then the header with the content type that we're expecting back from our request to the API. So let's go ahead and implement that. We'll keep that documentation up. Now, inside of our application, we currently, inside of our state, have our to-do items list with hard-coded dummy data. We're going to go ahead and remove that. And in order to make sure we don't have crazy errors, man, that really likes to move quick right there. Let's delete that. And then let's delete that. And then let's go ahead and get rid of the spaces. And we'll just have an empty array. Now with an empty array, we can go ahead and test this and make sure we didn't break anything by going back to our app, looking at it, and we can see we don't have any errors in our console, but we also have no to-do items. Now we can add to-do items like we did before. We can keep adding them. And of course, remember, we had these key issues because we were manually adding new elements and we were manually creating the ID and we weren't checking for uniqueness. Well, that all will automatically be fixed now that we're going to be pulling all of our list of to-dos from the database. And since Mongoose already handles providing us with all of our unique IDs, as we see right here, we're guaranteed that each one will have a unique ID when we get it back. So we're going to go ahead and change this up a little bit. So we've got an empty to-do list now, and really what we want to do is populate this to-do list when the component is ready to go. When it's ready to be rendered, we're going to want to have that data, or after it's first rendering, we'll want that state to be set with a new to-do list and have it re-render and provide us that list of to-dos that we got back from the API. Now, because it is going to be an asynchronous request, which is long-running or potentially long-running, we're going to want our component to be able to render without errors using an empty list. And then when that request comes back through the fetch API, we will then be able to set this state, and then the component will re-render, and we should have everything. Now, to do that, if we look at our components and then we look at our to-do list, no, our to-do create, that's the one that we had that has all of the events in it. So it's a class-based component. We switched our app to class-based, which means we now have access to all of these different events that are going to happen. Now in the constructor, we don't really want to put it in the constructor because we're setting our initial state in the constructor to an empty list, and we don't want to wait. So we're going to do it on the component did mount event, and it's in this one that we are going to go ahead and ask the API to send us back a list of all of our to-do items. So let's implement this lifecycle event inside of our app component. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and right down here we're just going to go ahead and let's make sure we are in our app, and right under here I'm just going to go ahead and add it. And now we have that lifecycle event inside of our app. So now we can listen for that event. So it is inside of this particular event that we are going to go ahead and make a fetch request. So if we come back to our fetch API documentation, we can see that we do a fetch. the URL, and then our configuration for that fetch. And then we're going to go ahead and we can handle the promises that are returned, or the promise that is returned from this fetch. Now, one thing to remember is that fetch is provided to us by the browser API. And so all modern browsers, or the majority of them, handle this, and we can check that by using can I use. So we're going to go ahead and use fetch first, and then in the next screencast we're going to learn how to use a third-party API that actually makes using or doing HTTP requests a little bit easier than fetch. I actually like it better than fetch, but we're going to use fetch to start out with. With that, let's go ahead and let's set up a fetch request. And for that we're going to do const. Actually, we don't need to store it because we're going to handle the promises right after we invoke it. So let's do fetch. And now this is where we need the URL right here. As you can see, we need the URL to make the request, and then we need our config. To do that, remember that we created down here in our lib a config file that has our base API, our API base URL. So we're going to need to import that. And we're going to need to specifically import our API base URL. So we're going to do something very similar to what we did within the subscriptions when we were doing the pub sub. Let's do import and curly braces. We're going to pull out the API base URL from, and then we need to go to our lib, and then we need to pull in our config file. And now we have our API base URL. So down here in fetch, since we're trying to get a list of our to-dos, we know that we're going to be following this pattern right here at the end of our base URL. And our base URL actually provides us with that trailing slash right here for the index of the website, so we don't need to add it, which means we're just going to be adding the resource name with a slash. So let's go ahead and do that right here. So we're going to do, what did we call it? We called it API base URL. So let's do API base URL plus, and then we know we're going to be doing to-dos as the resource, and we are handling getting all. So we're going to use the slash, which is the root of that resource, and we're going to be sending a get request. Now, because it's already a get request, it's ready to go. We actually don't have to provide a config object. We only need to provide that when we are using a post, and that is if the response comes back in the format JSON from our API, we should be able to go ahead and make this work. So then we add our then, which is how we handle the success. And so let's go ahead and add a response there. And then we are going to add our catch with an error. And of course, these take in handlers, so we're going to wrap that response as a parameter to an arrow function. And that's where we're going to handle the response. Same thing goes down here for a catch. We're going to wrap that as a parameter to an arrow function. And then we're going to handle that there. Now for right now, we're just going to do a console.log of the error if we get one, just so we can see what's going on. And then down here, if we get a response back, we are going to make the assumption that we're getting back an array of all of our to-do items. So let's go ahead, and in this one, we do a this.setState. And then inside of our setState, we're going to pass a state object for merging. And we are going to be setting our to-do items property of our state object equal to the response.body. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and see what happens in our browser in our application. Let's go ahead and refresh. And here we can see we get an error right here. And that is because our API is not set up for cores or cross-origin requests. So cross-origin request security is enabled on our application, which means that any requests that come to our API have to be coming from localhost port 8080, yet our React app is coming from localhost port 3000, which makes this a completely different origin than our to-do. So we actually need to come back to our API, and we need to implement cores on this particular API. So I'm going to go ahead and stop debugging. I'm going to show you how to do this. So open up a browser, and you're going to look up Express Cores. And right here, Express Cores middleware should be the first one that pops up. And here, we can see that we can require cores. And cores is a library that allows us to set our Express application to accept requests from any device that's coming from any domain or from any origin. And that's what we want to have happen here inside of our application. So we're going to do an Npm Install Cores. So let's come back to our application here. This is our API. And let's open up a terminal. And now inside of our terminal, we're going to do an Npm Install Cores. We're going to save it. So let's double check. C-O-R-S, C-O-R-S. Save it. So this is going to set about installing cores for us. Now once it's installed, we can see that we need to import cores, and then we need to tell our app to use cores. So let's go ahead and come to our app.js. Let's go ahead and import cores. So let cores equal require, oops, autocomplete, gotta love it. It just did it again. Require. And then let's do cores. And now I like to implement cores right here after Express starts up. So it's the first middleware that we're going to set up on our app. So let's just do app.use. And then we're going to say cores. And we're going to go ahead and execute that function, because cores is actually a function. And we can see that right here where we are taking that cores module that was imported, and then we are going to execute it using the parens. So we're executing cores. And when that gets executed, it's going to go ahead and set up cores on our app so that we can actually get to these paths on our API from a different origin. So to always make sure that you restart your application after you make changes to the source code. So let's go ahead and do debug, start debugging. And we are ready now to come back to our application. Let's refresh it. And let's see. We didn't get a cores error anymore, but we did see that props.todos.map is not a function of to-dos. And the best bet is that we set it to request.body for our to-do list. But we can debug that. I always like making sure we can see where things go wrong inside of our application. So let's go ahead and make sure this breakpoint is on inside of our to-do list right here where we're calling props.todos.map, which is where the error happened. Let's refresh our page. And here, if we hover over props to-dos, we can see that the array has nothing in it. So let's click play again. Now our web request went out. So the first break, here, let me start over. Let's go ahead and play the debugger. Let's refresh. Oh, we got ourselves stuck in an eternal loop. Let's go ahead and close that. Close it. Open up a new one. All right. So let's open up our, go to sources, refresh our page, and here, on this first loading of the page, our app is using, let's go to our app, it's using this state that we set up inside of our constructor. Where did we go? Where is it? Where is it? Oh, I'm inside of my API. Let's go over to our React app. All right, inside of our app, we are using a to-do items that is a blank array. So the first time the page goes to render, the to-dos is still an array, which means map is still a function, so it works just fine when we click play. But then inside of our component did mount, this fetch gets executed, and then we set state right here when it returns. And my guess is that when we set the state to response.body, this to-do items is no longer an array, it's something else. And so we're going to see that here. We got props is an object, and to-dos we see is a readable stream, which means it's really the body of our HTTP request coming back from the API, and it hasn't been converted to JSON yet. So that's where our error is. So if we click play, here's our error. Let's come back to our code and let's fix it. So it shouldn't be response.body. Let's try response.json and see if the body stream gets parsed into JSON for us as a returning object. And that's because we should see that the response from our application server is in the format of text slash or JSON slash application should be the body type. So let's come back to our application. Let's reload. We've got an error. We've got our breakpoint. You can see it's an empty array right now. We'll click play again. To-dos. It says it is JSON. Click play. To-dos, JSON, click play. And we still got an error. It is not what we think it is. It's not the array. So now we need to say, okay, what is going on right here in our response.json? And why are we not able to pull that data in? And it's because response.json is a function and I didn't invoke it. So let's go ahead and invoke it. Let's try again. Refresh. Of course, empty array to start out with. We click play. And now our to-dos is a promise. Click play. To-dos is a promise pending. Click play. Still getting an error right there. So our response.json, when we're converting the body of our application or the body of the response that we got from the HTTP, this returns a promise to us. And it is in that promise that once the conversion of the body actually gets turned into JSON, that we can then use it as an actual value. And what we're doing is we're kind of walking through how this works when we're using a fetch. And here, let's look at where we are handling an actual fetch response coming back. And here, you can see they're using the await on a response.json, which tells you right there that this really is an asynchronous event in that we have to wait for the body that came back, which is a binary stream, to be converted from a binary stream into actual JSON. So we need to make this happen first before we can go ahead and use that JSON object. So let's go ahead and do that. So this .set state needs to happen as a result of this response.json being properly parsed. So let's come down here and we can go ahead and do a response.json. Then we can call a .then on this one. And as a result of that, we should get back some JSON or JSON object. So let's go ahead and do JSON body. And then of course that is a fat arrow function to handle that as an event. And then again, because this is a .then, we can go ahead and tab that in, and then we're going to do a .catch on this as well in order to catch any errors that might happen. And again, it's a fat arrow function because we're really creating an event handler right there. And now this .set state actually needs to live here inside of this .then if it is a successful return. And this JSON body is now what we set to our to-do items list. Now, if we have an error, we're going to go ahead and handle that. And we're going to handle it right now pretty weakly with a log. We're just going to console.log that error if we have an error. Go ahead and clean up our spacing. All right, we don't have any errors there, so let's come back to our application. Let's refresh. All right, so we have our empty array. Click play again. Now we've got our to-do items list with 3 items in it. If we go over to our compass and we refresh, we should see we've got 3 items, Postman, Postman 2, and Postman 3. So if we look at our to-dos item list, we should see a Postman, Postman 2, Postman 3. And it's in that order because we're using a descending flag inside of our code. So let's go ahead and click play. Turn off that breakpoint. And here we can see our to-dos are happening. We're pulling them into our application by performing that fetch right here inside of our component did mount. So now we're getting a full list of our to-dos from our database. This means every time we refresh this page, we now have this dynamic list coming from the database rather than being hard-coded into our app's state. So much better, much better. We still have the problem in that when we add a new to-do item, it will be added to our list, but it's not being persisted. It's not being stored to the database. So this is where we're going to implement the post functionality in our application. But we need to do that inside of our to-do item create component. And we're going to handle that in the next screencast.